Hey everyone, what's up? It's Drew from the Drewsperience, the show that's combat sports, anime, now Canadian politics because I care about my country and I'm trying to learn more about it. And I think all Canadians need to somewhat be engaged today, whether that's municipal, provincial, or federal. But today's guest I've wanted to have on for a while. We came across on Twitter in a disagreement, actually, and speaking of which we were talking offline about crazy
Mhm.
X is. But today on the Drewsperience, I'm joined by one of Canada's sharpest independent political and defense commentators, Spencer Fernando, known for his clear, unapologetic analysis and his ability to cut through the noise. Spencer has become a leading voice on the issues that shape Canada's future at home and abroad. So, in today's episode, we're going to discuss why he got involved with defense policy. We're going to discuss the ongoing Gripen versus F-35. But overall, make sure to follow Spencer's page. He's got a website too for his blog where he posts about Canada's future on defense. And I think everyone should read it. Yes, it's to pay, but it's independent, and we all got to support our independent media as much as we can. So I'm very proud to be joined by the one, the only, the amazing Spencer Fernando. Welcome to the show, Spence.
Good to be here, Drew, and congratulations on all your success. You've been having a lot of great guests and getting a lot of attention, so it's very good.
Thank you. I mean, look, I
Mhm.
only got into this in August, and I know we'd spoken, said, yeah, let's have you on after the election, but I had to take a break,
Mhm.
adrenaline dump. But listen, I like working my way up. I want to get my feet wet in this new realm because when you go from one niche, which is combat sports, into politics, you really just can't dive in. Like, you need to build your way. You need to, like, go to a few events and then start having the guests on. That's how I do it. But
Mhm.
I got to ask you, because you have an interesting background, like when we were speaking, how did you get involved with politics to begin with?
Yeah, well, as a kid, I was always interested in, why the world was the way it
Mhm,
was. I remember the first political thought I can remember having was seeing a homeless person on the street and
mhm,
wondering, why is one person homeless? Why do I have a home? As a
mhm.
kid, right? You don't understand those things.
Right.
And so slowly learning that, politics is kind of it's what determines, how people do in the country, how relations between different countries in the world. And that I was lucky enough to live in a country where anyone could get involved, right? That's not the case for everybody. And so, yeah, just over time, I've been involved in a few different political parties, which, some people like, some people don't. But it's very interesting to, understand at least that we're all very blessed in Canada to have the chance to have these
Mhm.
discussions and to get involved in the political process because there's people, right now who in parts of the world are dying for what we have at this very moment.
Very true. And as you said, you saw a homeless person. My influence was, watching James Bond actually, and my father too,
Hmm.
who was a late father, was a lifelong conservative. So he's the one that taught me about, like, during the war on terror at the time, like about, like how foreign policy works, why a strong army is important. And that's what I got to ask. So you obviously you had your experience. What led to military and defense policy? Because that's not a common one that we see with a lot of Canadians.
Yeah, well, I've read, there's a lot of overlap between, politics and military history. Of
Mhm,
course, one can lead to the other, who countries elect or
mhm,
who comes to power can
mhm.
influence, whether they go to war or how a war goes. And so, I've been, for quite a long time concerned about Canada's place in the world, the
Mhm,
fact that we had such low defense spending. If you look historically, countries in our position with a lot of natural resources, a lot of what the world wants, a lot of space, and then not much of a military defense, bad things often tend to happen to those
mhm.
countries. And so, I've started to get more interested, in the last few years. And then, of course, with, the way the Trump administration has been talking about Canada, the way the
Mhm.
relationship with the US has changed, Russia invading Ukraine, China, launching the largest military buildup in the world since World War II.
Mhm.
I think it's long past time for Canada to take our defense seriously.
That's very true. And obviously, like, I mean, obviously, like some, like, like feel like a changing landscape where the US wants us to look in the mirror. Look, I might not agree with the messaging. I understand in a way, I understand both sides, but there's a way to go about it where you're like, look, as I said, I don't agree with Trump on everything. Like, there's certain things I like, but I'm not you know, like I'm very indifferent to the Trump administration. There's things I laugh at, but look, what you see is what you get. But the one thing that I will say is that Trump, whether you agree with the messaging or not, or the delivery, which it's not the best, I'd say, especially when you say we're going to annex, which kind of didn't help the conservatives, my party. I was like, oh damn, like we got like and other factors too. I think it's important that Canada, yes, as you said, they have to really look at their natural resources as it's gold to protect. Canada used to have an amazing military. When you think of it, Spencer, World War One with Vimy Ridge, World War Two, how we went into Normandy, D-Day. My late grandfather and great uncle, they served. Then you had the Korean War in Afghanistan, and then we just kind of fell off. But like as you said, we have this treasure chest of natural resources. What do you feel that Canada and how do you feel like Canada is and why do you feel Canada fell off so badly? Like after, say, like the Afghanistan war began when we participated in it.
Yeah, I think a big part of it was, I mean, one, we have a pretty good position in the world. I mean,
Hmm.
for until very recently,
Hmm.
we had, full trust in our neighbor,
Hmm.
who was the most powerful military force on the planet.
Hmm.
I think a big part of it too, though, and after the Cold War, you saw defense budgets fall everywhere. I mean,
Hmm.
people talk about the U.S. and sure they spend more on defense than we do as a percentage of their economy. Their spending is fairly close to historical lows for themselves, right? So
Hmm.
it's around the Western world as a percentage of GDP, of course. The total number is big, but the economy is bigger. But around the Western world, you've really seen a deterioration in military forces, really because we assumed, oh, the era of war is over. There's never going to be a big war. It's, the war on terror got a lot of attention. So that was, counterinsurgency, counter-terror operations. And then there was a feeling that, there's never going to be a big war in Asia. There's never going to be a big war in Europe. Obviously, Russia invading Ukraine has changed that. It's a massive conventional war in many ways. I mean, the scale of the war is huge, and that's really caught a lot of people and countries by surprise. I think it's just, it was very naive, but it was kind of based on a hope that, human nature had really changed,
Hmm.
that there's not going to be a massive world conflict ever again, and everything will be decided through negotiation and through trade. It would be nice if that's how it worked, but obviously it doesn't. And the problem with the world is you can have 99% of countries become very peaceful and pacifist, but if one country decides that they're going to be militaristic, then everybody has a problem because that country's going to hurt a lot of people.
Exactly. And it's interesting what you said, like the Russia-Ukraine war definitely changed that. I think that's where the Green Movement, as you just said, negotiations, treaties, that went all out the window because it's that one country. Then you have China, who is the sleeping dragon, as they say. And we saw there on the 80th anniversary of the founding of the PRC. They did this massive propaganda of showing their military weapons, the buildup, the ships, and they've obviously said like, if Russia's eyeing Ukraine, we got China eyeing Taiwan, and that's a big concern to me because what I'm thinking is while we're distracted with Ukraine and as the West is trying to like figure out that one, it's like kind of like in football where you do the fake pass and you see Putin, who's the quarterback, give it to his receiver, Premier Xing. And then obviously you see like China launch their so-called takeover of Taiwan and the Straits. So that's my biggest concern in today's new world order. As I can't believe I said that, their new world order. It's like an alternate 21st century we're
Mhm.
living in now, but it's the reality, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see a lot of the same mistakes being made
Hmm.
as were made prior to World War II. A lot of the
Hmm.
same arguments, right? For example, I think it's tough because life is difficult for a lot of people in Canada and the
Hmm.
Western world. A lot of people struggling with, the cost of living,
Hmm.
inflation. There's been a lot of economic strife. Never really fully recovered since from the 2008 financial crisis, then got hit with COVID. And so that has really messed up a lot of people's lives. So it's understandable that people want their governments to just focus here at home. The problem with that is the world is already so interconnected that you can't really escape what happens in other countries, right? And so people say, oh, well, we can't afford to support Ukraine, for example. Well, what happens if Russia overruns Ukraine and then goes into Poland? Canadian troops will be fighting in Europe. Global economic collapse. If NATO is fighting directly against Russia, there'll be a global economic collapse. So whatever we're paying now to help Ukraine, we're going to be paying way more if Ukraine falls and there's an even larger war. And the same in Taiwan. I mean, imagine what's going to happen to the chip sector, advanced chips. Either Taiwan Semiconductor will be destroyed or taken over by China. And obviously there'll be massive human suffering. They'll be assuming the US would, even if the US doesn't defend Taiwan, you're still going to have some sort of blockade, naval blockade, massive decline in world trade. So I think there's a sense a lot of people have of just if we just let dictators do what they want, everything will be fine, then there won't be a war. But history shows it doesn't work that way.
Hmm.
But the second someone like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping senses weakness from the West, they're going to go for another country and then another country and then another
Hmm.
country. They'll push until someone pushes back. And so I think one thing that concerns me is the attitude of the Trump administration seems to be originally they said, okay, we're not going to focus, the US isn't going to focus as much on Ukraine. We're going to focus more on China, right? Stopping China
Hmm.
and kind of hand Ukraine off to Europe to take care of. But I think that attitude has convinced Xi that, well, he can push more on Taiwan because the US isn't really going to fight. It isn't going to really stand up to anybody. And so that raises the chance of a conflict in Taiwan. And then I think, was it a few days ago or about a week ago, the new prime minister of Japan, who's considered very nationalistic, she said something about how Japan was going to defend
Yeah.
Taiwan, and Chinese diplomats have just been going crazy, saying just terrible things about
Yeah,
her.
they said one of them said in Osaka, we're gonna cut her head off.
Mhm,
It's like, and it's like, Jesus, like I don't know if you follow Gordon Chang,
mhm.
like he's very like
A
he's a
bit,
hawk
yeah.
on China. He was
Hmm.
like, this is wrong, and he goes, but at least Japan is showing strength now. And then you have China, like their propaganda is working overtime. So it's very interesting to see like how Asia is realizing that threat, and also Japan, who's
Hmm.
normally a pacifist since World War II, where they said we're never gonna have like an army. Now they're reeling. Oh, they're like, oh, we need to reopen that conversation and say,
Yeah.
hey, this is not 1995, like 1940. My bad, 1945. It's like
Hmm.
we gotta
Yeah.
start saying, hey, we need an army here, like South Korea has, and yeah.
Hmm.
So I think it's good to see whether you agree with Prime Minister Takechi or not, but it's good that like we have one ally that's saying like, hey, we have this dragon over here, like the sleeping dragon on China that's ready to like pounce at any moment. So
Hmm.
it's very interesting to see, but I agree in a way. Like, I mean, look, as much as I may not like the Ukraine war, look, this is Putin. This is like he has his worldview. I don't agree with much of what's going on either, but it's like there does kind of need to be a focus because if you have Article 5 enacted, that's like a whole can of worms that, like, as a Cold War historian that's taken the Cold War, you do not want Article 5 enacted. It's like DEFCON 5, like World War 3, Red Dawn, 1984, the movie we're looking at
Hmm.
basically.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, it's the way I look at it is if Germany could have been stopped in Poland, think of how many lives would have been saved. That's very much how I view, what's happening in
Hmm.
Europe. Is Putin has his, as you said, he has his worldview. He wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union,
Hmm.
and he views any concession really as weakness, right? And so, and the other thing too, one thing that's bothered me a lot is I see all this discussion of, oh, well, Ukraine has to do this to get into NATO, or they have to work on this issue to get into the European Union. Ukrainians are basically exclusively dying for to fight an enemy that NATO was supposed to fight, and that
Hmm.
Canada and the US had all said we were prepared to fight. So all Ukraine asked for is some weapons. I mean, the US has tons of surplus weapons that they're gonna, in many cases, dispose of, not even use or save for their own stocks. Canada we have a fair amount of money, not too many weapons in in reserve. But again, I think, and we can maybe talk later too about the fact that Russia's used a lot of propaganda on social media to
Hmm.
influence how people think as well. But it's very much a multi-domain conflict. I mean, you have China's propaganda. Iran, had a lot of propaganda in
Hmm.
Canada, people they were funding to influence people, the Iranian regime. And so I think there's kind of this sense that people have that, let's just hope it all goes away. We won't pay attention to the world. It's all just going to go away. And I think that's just not the case. These dictators are not going to just be, appeased by concessions. They're just going to get more aggressive.
Hmm. You have to fight. It's the case of speak softly but carry the big stick when
Hmm.
necessary. I gotta ask this because this is now to keep it to focused on Canada. The one thing we've seen in the news or when you're on like when you're looking at like articles from experts, like military experts, they say the far north and the Arctic is where we're very vulnerable. Obviously that we've had talks of putting some bases out in the territories. I like this economically too, Spencer. I mean, with the way at the auto industry, and we see like the massive layoffs coming. My solution is like, look, I don't agree with Mark Carney. I'll never vote liberal, but he's the prime minister. The people have spoken, and I have to be a pragmatist. My solution is if the PM wants to really win some favor and show that he's not like of the Trudeau era and that he's thinking like a centrist and trying to win over the undecideds, why not take those auto plants and those steel factories that are losing it and turn them into defense factories? Because in a way, like I know there's a controversy by saying, well, you're funding the war economy and the military industrial complex. But as this podcast is about, we're not in the 21st century of 2005. We're in the 21st century of 2025 where it's a changing world order basically. So why not like help the economy? You build those up by building like manufacturers for military parts and all, and then put the bases up in the territories. Like, is that something that would be a viable solution for Canada in a way?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I've written similar things in a few articles about how, to protect the industrial base in Canada,
Hmm.
protect jobs, obviously, and then protect, just production capacity, which you need in a war, right?
Hmm.
We should convert some of our auto plants to whether drone factories, making, armored vehicles, light armored vehicles, heavy armored vehicles, transport trucks. And then, yeah, we absolutely, you're right. We need to build a lot of bases in the north. So I think that's you make a good point about how people have kind of a bit of a hang up, like, oh, you're supporting a war, or you see this a lot, right? Oh, we're spending money on war. Well, if we don't spend money on preparing for war and Russia and China do, then do you think there's not going to be a war? They're not going to be like, oh, well, Canada didn't spend, so we're not going to attack you. They're more likely to attack. So it's interesting because it's sometimes tough to explain to people because it's almost like insurance. Military spending is like
Hmm.
insurance. You spend on it and hope you don't need it because if you do need it, it's obviously going to be a lot worse. And so you build up your military, hopefully, so that your potential enemies look and say, well, I don't think we could actually win a war, so we'll try to negotiate with you. It's paradoxical, but you're absolutely right. We do need to start converting some of these factories to building weapons and building equipment.
I definitely agree. And also, we spoke about like when we started early stock talking, and where we came to an agreements on was I said we have the mines. Like we hear about the mines in Nova Scotia, the territory's critical minerals, and Europe wants that. Like open it up, like cut the red tape and the bureaucracy. Because here's how I look at it: this could help us get our to our 5%. We do need, like, from what I understand, we need new tanks, our Leopard 2s, our Cold War era. We need something
Mhm.
new. We need new jets, which we'll get to on that. We need new munitions. We need new rifles, apparently. So Europe's offering that. Like, look, I know, like, I'm not saying abandon the US, but diversify. It's like you have a stock, I have a stock portfolio, you have a stock portfolio. I know we hear the word diversify, and it's like becoming a buzzkill word, but Canada has the gold to help build that insurance up to meet our obligation. Is that something that you would agree with?
Certainly. I mean, this is the irony is that Europe builds very good weapons. The US, of course, builds good weapons. Canada has, as you say, massive amounts of natural resources. There's no reason why we should be that worried about Russia in terms of capability. Like with a relatively small effort, Europe, Canada, and the United States could easily outmatch Russia. Canada our own could, build a military that, well, not as big as Russia because they have a bigger population, could be certainly just as advanced, if not more so. Germany has a much bigger economy than Russia does. France has a much bigger economy. The United Kingdom. And so it's, the years of underinvestment have really forced us to catch up. And governments are starting to do that. Even Canada is increasing. But there's a lot of catching up to do. And as you say, we need to start making these trades. What does Europe need? They need natural resources. They make very good weapons. They need money injected into their defense companies so that they can expand and produce more weapons. Well, we need a lot of weapons. So trade some resources for weapons. That's kind of common sense.
It's a great way of barter and exchange. And also Asia too, we've spoken about this. I wanted to ask your thoughts about this. South Korea, who I would say is kind of like the Israel of the Middle East, it's a democracy. Well, I don't agree with their president now because of like what the hell what they're doing with the purges and all
Mhm.
that. But South Korea normally, historically, Spencer, they have two very hostile neighbors, North Korea, China, and they become sort of like this like Lord of War for Asia. And we were discussing they have the subs, they have the K-57s. How do you see Canada and South Korea's relationship militarily and economically? Because you just said the US is great, Europe is great, but South Korea is this dark horse. So tell me about South Korea as if I am in layman's terms, and why Canada should consider South Korea for military trade as well.
I think South Korea is a great example because they're a country that, in many ways, similar to Canada, democracy, rights, human rights, freedom, individual freedom. But what's so different is that they are basically living under the constant threat of a massive war. At any time, they think they could either get, attacked from a massive artillery barrage that would kill a ton of people in their capital city. There's obviously the nuclear threat from North Korea because it's assumed they have 50 to 100 or so nuclear weapons. And so it's a country that in many ways similar to Canada, but has been forced to, out of, existential need, to build a massive defense industry and not to be reliant on others. That's the key thing for South Korea, right? They don't want to be having to ship a bunch of weapons from elsewhere in the case of a war, because if they don't win in the first few weeks, then their country doesn't exist. And so I think that's a country we should learn from because they're democratic, very free, but they've managed to put a lot of money into building their own domestic defense industry. And that's something Canada, and we kind of need initially we need to buy a lot of weapons from other countries because we don't produce many on
Mhm.
our own. But we need to over time learn to become more self-sufficient. And South Korea could certainly teach us a lot about that.
That's very true. I love what you said there. They got the subs that we've been eyeing. I really like the K-57 tanks because you have Hyundai
Mhm.
Motors. You think of Hyundai as the car company, but they're actually involved in the military sector. And from what I've been seeing, and you were telling me too, the K-57s are a better tank than the Leopards coming out of Germany for how they're cost efficient, they do just as well as a job, and we can buy them in large numbers. Is that like one, like if you're right now, like if you're in Prime Minister's Carney's or Tim Hodgson's, 'cause I think Hodgson and Carney are the ones that are like, Hodgson is like resources, but I'm pretty sure he also has the military file, defense file, maybe. I'm not sure. I'm speaking out of my ass here. But when it comes, if you're in PM Carney's ear and they say, okay, we need some new tanks, which country would you go with between South Korea and Germany more, and why?
Well, it's a tough one. Poland is buying a lot from South Korea,
Hmm.
and they build some of themselves, together. They're kind of working together on some that are customized for Poland.
Hmm.
Poland's buying a lot of everything, of course, because they know things could be very tough for them, very soon. Hopefully not, but they're preparing, which is smart. The thing with Germany is that we already have the Leopard 2s, and so if we got, upgraded Leopards or the KF-51, I think is the new one they're working on, the new Panther tank. Not sure if they'll keep that name because it has some historical connotations.
Yeah,
But
good one.
in some cases it would just be an upgraded turret built on the chassis of the current Leopard 2s. So it might be simpler for Canada to just upgrade some of the ones we have. But we only have what, maybe 50 to 80 tanks. I don't know how many of them are even in working order. So, we need to, upgrade some, but we need to buy a whole bunch of others, right? So I think we could probably do both. I think, there's a lot of, and I'm sure we'll get to this with the Gripen
Oh
F-35, there's a
yeah.
lot of kind of opposition to buying, mixed fleets and of different equipment, but part of it's maintaining relationships, and part of it is you have to sign a good deal. So if you can get a deal with Germany to upgrade some of our current tanks to a more advanced model, then it makes sense because we already operate them and know how to use them. And then if you can do a deal with South Korea, perhaps to start building some tanks in a factory in Canada, then you're building a relationship with South Korea and then capability for the future. So I think you could probably do both.
That's a great. I agree. So then we're gonna move to the hottest debate on social media: the
Mhm.
Gripen versus the F-35. I've seen now. I haven't said anything that I disagree with you on because you probably you have presented a case for the Gripens, and then we have people that say like it's like, oh my, it's like I see the takes like, do you not understand aircraft aviation? Like, I mean, look, I played Ace Combat, bro. I mean, that's not a good sample size. But listen, I mean, I've watched, videos of the F-35. I've seen the Gripen. I think you present a good case for the Gripens in a way because of, how efficient they are and how this partnership Sweden's offering. My case is I think we should get the F-35s, but not close the door on the Gripens. I'm for the mixed fleet. I read Michael Grev's article. So I want to tell you, you're going to tell me why you like the Gripens, and then I'll tell you my case for the F-35s and maybe a mixed fleet. So, Spencer, why should Canada go with the Gripens over the F-35s so everyone can hear your case for it?
Well, I support a mixed fleet as well. I wrote
Oh,
an article
interesting.
where where I said we should do the 50-50 plan, which
Mhm.
is get 50 F-35s and then buy 50 Gripens. That was before some of the discussion of the possibility of producing more of them in Canada.
Mhm.
So I think that's a good deal too. I think, we saw with, Israel dismantling the Iranian regime's
Mhm.
air defense network with the F-35, and Iran had absolutely no idea what was happening, no
No,
idea.
they were
And
taken
so
by
that
complete
was,
surprise.
yeah. And so that was a very good proving ground because Iran was using a lot of weapon systems that they got from Russia or the Soviet Union, perhaps, is when they would have gotten some of them. But that's who, if Canada, say we end up fighting in Latvia or Estonia or Lithuania, that is the kind of defense systems that we would be going up against, presumably if we send fighter jets over there in the future. And so it makes sense to get an F-35s because they perform very well. With the Gripen, it's about, for one, building the domestic production capacity within Canada because
Hmm.
that's what Sweden's offering. And it's about hedging against the possibility that Donald Trump or perhaps JD Vance in the future decides that for some unrelated trade reason they don't want to send us planes. I think that's a big part of it for me
Hmm.
is, Trump has shown a willingness to, use leverage in a way that other presidents have not, in many
Hmm.
cases violating deals the US has signed. And so as much as I'd like to think we wouldn't face a situation where the US withholds weapons from us that we've paid for and purchased. I don't think we can assume that would happen. I mean, imagine here's kind of how I look at it. So say we reject the Gripen entirely and say we're
Hmm.
going to buy say 80, 85, or is it
F-35s.
88? Yeah, 85, F-35s. And so 3 years pass, it's close to the end of the Trump administration. Um, he puts out a tweet and says, because of a softwood lumber issue that the Canadians have attacked America on, we're going to cancel their F-35 order. Well, if that happened, we would then find ourselves not getting F-35s and we would have lost a relationship with Sweden. So we'd be really screwed, right? We would have no fifth generation fighters, nothing to replace the CF-18s. And so I think a big part of it is that, we have to hedge our bets with the United States
Hmm.
because of how the country has changed, at least under the current administration and possibly future administrations. And so, I think to completely reject the F-35 would obviously damage trade relations with the United States. It shouldn't impact it, but obviously that's how they see things. They're going to punish us if we do something that they see as disrespectful to them, even though we have the sovereign right to decide what kind of weapons we buy. But and it's a good plane, so we should, to completely reject it would not be logical. We need to buy good equipment. But to, close the door on Sweden, cancel that relationship, and then possibly be left completely at the mercy of the United States for our weapons, I think would be a mistake.
That makes sense. I can understand the logic and rationale between for the Canada, especially with like, the way that the Trump administration has been, whether you agree with it or not. I'm for the mixed fleet as well because you got to diversify, as you said. There's
Mhm.
partnerships, and then there's the Raffaele too. But the Gripen, like, I have a friend who I train karate with who's in the army, and he explained it very well to me when we were talking about the Gripens. He goes, I love the F-35s, great sample size of what they did to the Islamic Republic during the 12-day, the occupying Islamic Republic. You know how I am because I'm half Iranian.
Yeah.
So he said it was a great, like, sample size to show what the F-35 can do because the software can, it's like a video game where it can tag who the friendlies are, who the enemy is, and like where they are, and you could do stealth.
Hmm.
But the Gripens have a way though of surviving the cold. Now, I know some have said no, the F-35s are in Alaska. It's pretty cold there. But I think you need to have a mixed flight, a mixed fleet because the Gripens have a way of dumping their fuel tanks or their weapons in order to escape like those anti-air SAMs. As I was reading in Grev's article, you presented it too. And I think the having the Gripens for the far north, especially like say in Manitoba, the territories, that would be a great buffer of insurance to tell, like, to show the Russians and the Chinese, okay, like, you want to enter, this is what's going to happen with NORAD. So I could see like the benefits of having a mixed fleet. But for me, I'm a Raptor guy because that's just me. But the Gripens too have proven like they can do great as well. And is there any other country that can sneak in there to say, hey, add another kind of plane to really mix it up? Like who's another country that has impressed you in the aviation sphere?
Yeah, well, there is the GCAP, the Global Combat Air Program. I think it's Japan, the United Kingdom, and Italy, if I'm
Hmm.
not mistaken. That's 10 years from now where they're going to probably produce a plane. I think 2032 initially, but nothing really in full production for about another decade. I think that would be a good program for Canada to join. They've said they're open to people joining, and that would be us kind of getting in kind of on the ground floor with a new plane. So again, developing capacity ourselves.
Hmm.
I think we should partner certainly with perhaps the United Kingdom and Germany on developing autonomous aircraft. I think that's the next thing. And The other thing too about working with Saab is they're producing obviously the Gripen, but they're also now working on an autonomous fighter jet.
Hmm.
And so I think that's the other thing about building a relationship. If we can get in on the ground floor at the start with a company that is starting to produce, unmanned aircraft, that's really the future in many cases, right? So
Drone
I
warfare.
think, yeah. And so it's not just about, what we get immediately. It's about kind of long-term thinking. And that's been very absent in Canada, right? Because we've been so neglectful of the military. Basically, we don't spend, we don't spend, we don't spend. Whatever capability we have starts to collapse. There's a bunch of news stories about how it's collapsing. We get desperate, then we buy something, and then we forget about it for the next decade, right? And that's just not in a massive conflict. That's not going to hold up. Look at
Mm.
what's happening in Ukraine. The amount of equipment that is lost. Basically, your army's equipment is wiped out multiple times, and you need to keep producing. So the idea that we'll just keep getting, stopgap measures and just buy just enough to get through the next few years, that's not going to hold up in a big conflict.
Very, very interesting. Now, I got to ask this because I got to shape it from because take it back to the beginning when you said you had your experience with politics, with seeing, understanding why, and you've been around parties. When it comes to obviously military entertainment, like in terms of movies. Now, I'm gonna ask this because I'm gonna throw you off here. This is a tough one. Red Dawn from 1984 or Red Dawn from 2012 remake? Which one do you prefer?
I don't think I've seen the 2012 remake, so I'd have to go with 1984, I think. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I've
Yeah.
seen both, and I'm of the 1984 one because that was the most realistic. Like it was basically in
Hmm.
a time where, and it's funny how history really repeats itself because all it takes is it's like when you watch the beginning of 80 of like Red Dawn 84, it talks about like, as you said, the dangers of isolationism, where like the Green Party in Europe like takes power, they're anti-nuclear, the UK is left on their own. There's a crop shortage in the Soviet Union, so they start invading. There's a revolution in South America down south, and then you see, and then obviously the states are divided up. And like the one thing that lives rent free in my head was when, if you remember the scene where it's the Wolverines and it's the Air Force pilot, and they say like, what happened to the states, and he goes, they the states have been divided up. There's the occupied by the Russians
Hmm.
and the Cubans, and then there's the free states. And it's like, well, who's the free states? And it's like Texas, New York, and it's like, of course, Texas. They're the ones that are going to
Hmm.
be the most fighting. But I mean, in a scenario with if the Russia would launch an invasion, do you feel, to take it to this now, in actual reality? And this is not a
Hmm.
joke, like, because I mean, when I watch the movie, it's like, oh, I could understand the paranoia here, because only the paranoid survive. Could we see like a situation where the Russians would come in from the north, and then there'd be like a bit of like the country is like half of it's closed off through occupation, and then you have like the free provinces? Is that something that could happen in a real scenario if Russia and China actually did something like that?
Well, yeah, I think one thing the government needs to prepare for is what would happen if a lot of our technology was just taken offline immediately,
Hmm.
right? Because, I've seen people say, how would you know World War III is happening? And
Hmm.
it said you would just start wondering why is the internet not working? Why can
Hmm.
I not get in touch with anybody, right? It would actually feel very quiet initially in many cases because you would have satellite networks taken out. I remember there's a story maybe a year ago or so. I don't know. Time seems to move strangely now. But there was a story a year or so ago where there was real concern in the US that Russia had, launched a satellite that was basically designed to kill other or launched a weapon into space that was
Hmm.
designed to kill satellites.
Hmm.
And so that's how a war would start. So I think governments need to take seriously the fact, especially in the north, as you say, Russia could maybe test Canada and say, well, we're going to land 10,000 people on what's technically Canadian territory. They'll say it's disputed. Can you push us off? Do you have the power to push us away? And so I think governments need to have some sort of thought of, one thing I've talked about is around major cities, you need to place weapons depots guarded by the military, obviously military installations, and they would have, supplies to food supplies, obviously for people, a certain amount of weapons for people who could, who be in the reserves who could go there and just prepare for a very low tech conflict. 90% of our preparation should be for a high tech conflict because that's most likely. 10% should be low tech. And part of that is obviously producing a lot of artillery. That's one thing they talk about drones in Ukraine and the Russia war. But in many cases, they're using drones because they run out of artillery. Artillery
Hmm.
is still more efficient in many cases. And so we have these discussions about F-35 versus the Gripen, all these high level weapon systems. How many 155 millimeter artillery shells can you produce, right? That's one of the biggest determinants in
Hmm.
what's happening in Ukraine. And so I think it's important that we also keep the focus on, are you producing small arms? Are you producing body armor? Are you producing transport trucks? Logistics is huge. That's one thing Russia really messed up at the start of the war is they were prepared for what, a week or so of fighting, and then they ran out of fuel, right? And so they just got, massacred on their way trying to invade Ukraine at the start. And so getting logistics right, Canada's obviously got a lot of territory to defend, so we have to have a lot of trucks and a lot of fuel. And so I think, you know, it's nice to be positive about the future. I think in the long run, humanity is going to become more peaceful, more inclusive and more open. But the long run might be 500 years. There could be 50 years where it's very terrible. And so we need to prepare for that possibility and, do the best we can to make sure that if things get really bad, we're at least prepared for it. And people don't like to think about it. They don't like to imagine terrible scenarios, but, choosing not to think about it doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Better to be the swordsman in the garden than the gardener during a
Hmm.
war, as the saying goes.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Yeah.
Let's say always be pragmatic. That's how I am.
Mhm.
So I got to ask you because obviously, we've spoken. I've said Red Dawn is an influence for me. My biggest influence is to get into military history. Well, actually, history and politics was my dad. How he taught
Mhm.
me. So I had a primary source there. I also would say Lord of War. That was a very influential
Mhm.
movie. I know a lot of people like would say, "Wow, is that influential?" Because you understand how the military industry works in a way. Red Dawn, and then probably some of the James Bond movies, to be honest, like GoldenEye, I'd say, Living Daylight specifically, because you had like, like the funding of like proxy wars, like with the Mujahideen that MI6 in the US did. Was there any like, I know I shouldn't say Hollywood, but any like of like, fictional works that got you into what you do now in a way that paved the way, or was it more like contemporary nonfiction?
More so reading about history, and I
Mm-hmm.
do played Hearts of Iron. I don't know if you played that. That's an interesting game. It gives you a good sense of the kind of the boring aspect of war, right? It's
Hmm.
all right. Oh, oops, I didn't produce any ammunition, didn't produce any guns, right? And so you spend all your effort on high level weapon systems, and then you don't produce the basics, and so things don't go well for you. But a lot of it is reading history. Read a lot about World War II,
Hmm.
especially, what led to it. I was always, thinking of it was so obvious that Germany was going to start attacking people. And
Hmm.
yeah, again, the fascists in Germany had very clearly laid out what their plan was: kill millions of people,
Hmm.
completely reshape Europe in a horrific way. Obviously, the Holocaust was planned, for a long time. And so people around the world saw all these things started to happen, but it was the same idea. Like, oh well, let's just hope for the best, hope that just make another concession to the
It's a
fascists
European
and yeah.
conflict. Let them
Hmm.
solve it. Like it's their
Yeah.
issue.
And so it's seeing, the thing about reading history that's important is you realize that the reason, we're able to talk here today, the reason that people of a lot of different, races and backgrounds exist and can be successful, in diverse countries is because of how World War II went.
Mhm.
The fascists had a very different vision for the world. A whole bunch of people who are alive today wouldn't be alive if that war had gone differently.
Mhm.
And so the the lesson from that is, yes, it's important to have your values as a country. Yes, it's important to be a democracy. Yes, it's important to treat people with respect and to have a positive view of the world. But survival sometimes comes down to how many weapons you produce. And it's a very rational process and it's a very there's no you can't really, talk your way out of it. You can't really, negotiate your way out of it. If someone's coming for you and it's a ruthless dictator and they want to destroy your country, then you either have the weapons to fight them back or you don't. And I think we need to get back to a little bit of the mindset that, as you say, Canada was very powerful in World War II, especially if you look at compared to our population, the size of our economy, and then how big our military became. And so I see people today and they say, oh, Canada's a small country, Canada can't do anything. That's not true at all. We have a bigger economy than South Korea. We have a bigger population than a lot of countries that are I mean, Israel's a great example. 10 million people, relatively small economy, very few natural resources, and look how powerful they are. Look what they're able to achieve because they know they can't lose. If they lose, then their country's going to be destroyed, right? So they have an
Exactly.
existential reason to survive and to fight. And so Canada needs to learn a bit of that attitude. Same with South Korea, and same with Ukraine, fighting, being prepared to fight for your life. And so in many ways we're lucky because if it's a big war in Europe, then we're going to be sending people and equipment over. We're not going to be having it most likely on our territory, although Russia could go in the north, maybe China. And so we can't assume that won't happen. But we're still relatively well placed in the world, but we can't let that make us complacent and naive, which has happened for far too long. People think, nothing will ever happen in Canada, nothing will ever happen in Europe, nothing will ever happen in Asia. The age of war is over. Well, obviously it's not.
No. What's so to and then to like the last question I have, damn, we did really good for the time, like we said. I actually
Mhm.
called it. What is
Mhm.
your, I mean, look, we cannot have a crystal ball, but what is your prediction in the next 16 to 24 months with how Canada improves its defense policy? What do you see happening if you had a crystal ball?
Well, I think we're going to be better positioned than we are now, obviously.
Hmm.
Carney, we saw yesterday, for example, with the memorandum of understanding with Alberta,
Hmm.
he's definitely not Justin Trudeau. He's definitely more pragmatic and serious. I mean, Stephen Guilbeault taking a hike, from politics, that tells you something, right? He was quite radical, and he's not happy with what's happening, which I think is a good sign. If he's not too happy, it probably means the government's being a
That's where
little
we could
more
agree on.
pragmatic.
You see, like I know,
Yeah.
I would say, like if I may assume, like I've said I'm more of like I'm not a SoCon. I'm more of like a
Mhm.
centrist. I'm an economic hawk, but like I'm more libertarian. But it's like I can understand the meaning of social systems. I'd say you're what more of a centrist, independent, classified as a blue liberal or just centrist, basically. Because I see you more as a pragmatic guy.
Yeah, I was definitely much more on the populist right before. I've
Hmm.
certainly moved away from that. I would consider myself pretty centrist.
Hmm.
This is the other thing, we're kind of in an era where politics is shifting, I favor generally low taxes, individual freedom, government should stay out of people's lives and invest in a strong national defense, free trade, human rights, respect for differences and everything. And so that would have been center right for sure before, but the center right is changing a lot with the populism and with Donald Trump and the influence,
Hmm.
see what's happening in Europe too with some of the center right parties. And so I guess that's more centrist now. But I think the one the one thing that I think is really important is just, not necessarily partisanship, putting that aside, but what is good for the country as a whole, and certainly for Canada, you cannot get by spending 1% of GDP on national defense in
No,
today's world. And so I think that is starting to change and is starting to improve. The challenge we have, of course, is the procurement system has been terrible for such a long time. It's built for the idea that you're using it just to basically create government jobs and you're not really investing in any capability. So that has to change. I mean, you can say you're going to spend 3% of GDP, but if your procurement system doesn't let you spend it effectively, then you're going to waste a lot of the money. And so that's what I'm going to be looking for now. I'm glad the Carney government has said they're going to spend a lot more.
same here.
Yeah, he made that pledge almost immediately and delivered on it in the budget. But now the question is, are they going to actually turn those pledges and that money into real capability? So that's what I'm going to be keeping an eye on now.
Same here. Same here. Listen, as I said, I'm conservative. I vote. I'm a card carrying member, but I want my country to succeed, regardless of the prime minister. I might disagree with them. I might not like their personality, but if they can bring in some good policies, great. And that's a bipartisan issue. The military. To invest in the military, it's not partisan, it's bipartisan because we all have family members that have served, we all have friends that have served, etc. And it's as you said, this conversation is about if you have a good defense, especially for what Canada sits on, then we're going to thrive as a country. Because I truly believe we could be the South Korea of the North America.
Mhm. Yeah, I think we absolutely should be. We have a relatively similar economy, very smart population, very well educated, a lot of great tech companies, strong military history. We just haven't invested in it. And so if that starts to change, then I think the sky's the limit for us.
Agree, Spencer. I'm so happy we got to do this instead of arguing on X and all. Like it's great to do this. I'm
Mhm.
real. Where can people connect with you? Because please plug in everything you do, and I really hope you enjoyed the conversation today in doing this.
That was a great discussion. This is what Canada needs. There's, the regular media, you could call it, establishment, however, legacy media, it has an important role, but they've focused very much on short-term issues, right? They're starting to see a little more coverage of the military, but these are the conversations Canada needs, people talking about the military and the future of our national defense, because we don't have the luxury of not thinking about it. So I appreciate what you're doing as well. It's very important. In
Thank you,
terms
man.
of finding my work, you can go to spencerfernando.com, and then I have a newsletter on Patreon. So I think if you look up Spencer Fernando on Patreon, that's where I mostly focus exclusively on Canadian politics, more defense and sovereignty issues are at spencerfernando.com.
Amazing. Well, Spencer, I really thank you for doing this. Hopefully, we can do this again in the future. If like a
Certainly.
conflict flares up, because you never know. It was really an honor to have you on and to do this. Like, it really made my Friday good because,
Mhm.
that's why, guys, if you're fed up, I'm going to say this right now because a lot of people, we see it on X, they complain. Guys, I'm going to say it what my friend said. One of my friends said. If you're unhappy with the political situation, get involved. Get a membership, get involved with your electoral district association, start a podcast, start a blog. But if you're going to do that, just remember the biggest advice I can give to others is the relationships. Don't try to look for clicks, build the relationship because once you have the relationship, then the views and the clicks come. Well, not clicks, more views, but it's about being do you want to be like do you want to be a disturber or like an agitator or do you want to be a builder? And I choose to be a builder. Sometimes I can be a bit off the wall, but I think Spencer, you're right. We need to really have these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. No, appreciate it.
Perfect. Well, I want to say, guys, make sure to hit the like, share, subscribe button to the Drewsperience. Follow Spencer Fernando on X and spencerfernando.com with his newsletter because he's giving you a very poignant view of what defense policy is that you will not get in the media really unless like you really want to pay attention. So do that, Spencer. Great to have you on and let's do this again sometime.
Sure. Take care.